Welcome to today's Employment Standards mini overview on overtime. Thank you for joining us. Before we begin, please be aware of our disclaimer and copyright notice. I'll give you a moment to read it. Basically, we've made every effort to give you the correct information, but if there are any discrepancies between this presentation and the Employment Standards Code, the code will prevail. Please note the copyright of this presentation belongs to the Government of Alberta. When it comes to overtime, most employees are entitled to overtime pay at 1.5 times their wage rate for any hours worked over 8 hours in a day or 44 hours in a week, whichever is greater. This is known as the 844 rule. Banking time is permitted with a written banked overtime agreement. Overtime is banked at a rate of 1 banked hour for each overtime hour. Banked overtime can sit for 6 months from when it is earned, and if it is not used, it is then paid out at 1.5 times the wage rate. The regulation outlines which industries and occupations the 844 rule does not apply to. For example, there are alternative overtime rules for certain industries like trucking, which is anything over 10 hours per day or 50 hours per week. Managers and certain professionals like engineers, accountants, and insurance agents are not entitled to overtime, but may be entitled to regular pay for all hours worked. Let's consider a scenario and apply the 8 and 44 rule for the overtime entitlement. First, calculate the daily overtime hours. This employee worked more than 8 hours per day on Monday, which was 2 hours of overtime, Tuesday, 1 hour of overtime, and Thursday, 3 hours of overtime, for a total of 6 daily overtime hours. Secondly, calculate the employee's weekly overtime hours. 54 is the total for all the hours of work for the week, and then subtract 44 from it. The total number of weekly overtime hours is then 10. Finally, compare both the daily and weekly hours and then pay the greater amount to the employee. This means for this scenario that the employee is entitled to receive 10 hours of overtime at 1.5 times their wage rate. As stated previously, all overtime must be paid at a rate of at least 1.5 times the regular rate of pay, or bank time off is given at a rate of 1 hour banked for 1 hour of overtime as part of an overtime agreement. Salaried employees are treated no differently than employees paid in any other manner when calculating overtime hours. The salary is considered to cover payment only for the regular hours of work. Overtime hours must be compensated in addition to the regular hours worked. When an employee takes bank time off, those hours and the subsequent payment are considered wages. Those wages are then to be considered when calculating vacation pay and general holiday pay entitlements. Please note that some employees and industries aren't eligible for overtime hours and overtime pay. To learn more about the industries who are exempt or have different overtime rules, please visit the Employment Standards website. As an example, Amelia is paid a biweekly salary of $2,500 for 40-hour work weeks. For inventory, she had to work an extra 8 hours over the weekend. Her work contract states any hours worked that exceed 40 hours in a week are overtime. Amelia's wage rate is $2,500 biweekly. Divide this rate by 80 hours worked in the pay period to determine her hourly rate, which is $31.25 per hour. To determine the overtime rate, multiply 1.5 by $31.25, which means Amelia is entitled to $46.88 per hour for any overtime hours worked. And so, Amelia should receive 8 hours additional pay at $46.88 over and above her biweekly salary, for a total of $375 in overtime. Here are the requirements for banking overtime. Their agreement must be in writing, and the parties must follow the other overtime rules. Head to the address listed to find sample overtime agreements that you can download and utilize. Some employees and industries aren't eligible for overtime hours and overtime pay. These include managers and supervisors, meaning people who can hire or dismiss employees or begin disciplinary proceedings for these types of actions. Those employed in a confidential capacity, often people who are in a management capacity when budget, policy, or competitive strategy are concerned, but who don't necessarily manage people. Waged and non-family farm and ranch employees. Professionals, including architects, certified or chartered accountants, chiropractors, dentists, optometrists, podiatrists, psychologists, and veterinarians, and salespeople of automobiles, trucks, buses, farm machinery, and manufactured home or residential homes. To learn more about the industries who are exempt or have different overtime rules, please visit the Employment Standards website. Oil well servicing definitions. These include the operation performed or service provided that is necessary for the completion, recompletion, or remedial treatment of any oil or gas well, or the supplementary operation performed or service provided that is necessary to the drilling of an oil or gas well, but does not include the actual drilling of the well. Oil well servicing exemptions. No restrictions on daily hours of work. For overtime, hours greater than 12 hours per day or 191 hours per month, as well as overtime if working less than 191 hours in the first or last month of employment, which means hours greater than 12 hours per day or 44 hours per week. And that brings us to the end of our mini overview on overtime. If you would like to learn more about various employment standards topics, such as the ones listed on the screen, please scan the QR code to be taken to our website. Also, if you have a question, wish to make a complaint, or submit an anonymous tip to Employment Standards, please scan the QR code on the screen or call our contact center at 1-877-427-3731. Thank you for viewing today's session on overtime, and we hope that you have a pleasant day.